All right, hey, this is Vaughn with the Spirit of Health Children's Fair 2018. I'm introducing Jessica Bonovich. I got it right. Jessica works with Great Plains Laboratory. She's a registered nurse. So interesting doing now what you're doing now versus what a lot of nurses are doing. Jessica, and it'll probably embarrass her, but I'm just going to say she's very smart. So I'm really hoping she keeps it to layman's terms today.
That's my goal.
Because I talked to her and go over these lab test results, and it's like, whoa, I've been doing this for 10 years, and I just learned more than I can process. So anyway, she knows a lot about the body, lab testing, how different things work in the body, different supplements and things that can help with, restoring health based on lab tests being off. So she really, really knows her stuff. I've learned a lot from her, so I'm excited to see what she has to say today. So
Thanks.
I'll turn it over to you, Jessica.
Thanks. Thanks for saying those nice things about me. So as Vaughn mentioned, my name's Jessica. I'm the clinical consultant at the Great Plains Laboratory. So my job is not typically to stand up and give talks. My job is actually to sit behind a desk and look at test results for a living. And I look at thousands and thousands of test results. And I talk to practitioners from all over the world. And so my job is to help people to interpret what these test results really mean from a functional standpoint, because they're very nuanced, they're very individualized, they're outside of the mainstream. So the science is intact, but the way that we apply it to each individual can be somewhat different depending on that individual. So that's my job. My job is to help break it down and put it into some perspective for individuals. Are you able to hear me okay? Do I need to put my microphone on? Okay, tell me if I need to.
Yeah, when you go that way, I can't hear as well as
I can put a microphone on if I need to. I don't project very well, so let me know, okay? So part of my job actually is a lot of education, and a couple of the concepts that I was kind of hoping to educate you all about today are concepts that a lot of even practitioners struggle with. And there are these sort of nebulous, hard to nail down concepts related to toxicity and also what I refer to as metabolic compensation. So I'm hoping to drill down into these concepts a little bit more, and I'm hoping to talk to you a little bit about how these are different for children, right? So these things, these ways in which we compensate are different in a growing and developing child. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about, they might be a little bit anxiety producing. They might, for face value, be maybe a little bit disarming to hear about when we go into all of these different factors, because children really are a very vulnerable population. But it's not my intention to scare at all. And I am going to be presenting solutions for the things that we can do about all of these various aspects that are very specific to children, right? So, and I'm also going to be taking questions at the end. I love answering questions, so please don't hesitate. On the back of your handout, there's a little place to take notes, so if you want to write those down. These are very complicated sort of concepts, so please don't hesitate to ask, because if you have that question, guaranteed somebody else definitely does. So let's start with the concept of toxicity. All right, so for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to define it very broadly in terms of just a molecule that can cause damage to a cell. So with that in mind, somebody give me an example of a toxin, something that is a molecule that can cause damage to a cell. Anybody? Lead, heavy metal, absolutely, very damaging to cells. Anybody think of any other potential sources of maybe a molecule that causes damage to a cell? Bacteria, absolutely, and yeast and fungus, heavy metals, pesticides, absolutely. We kind of lump that into the category of things that are kind of off-gassing and non-metal toxins that are somewhat ubiquitous and everywhere around us, even in this room, as wonderful as this room is, right? But they're everywhere. They're not metal, but they're not expected, and they're a part of our environment. So those are all really great examples. Does anybody have any other thoughts? I just wanted to just see if anybody thought about maybe the immune system. Does the immune system create molecules that can cause damage to a cell? Yeah, that's what it's designed to do. It's designed to do that by the very nature of it, but in so doing, it sometimes causes damage to our own cells too. Right? And another thing that causes damage to the cell that even practitioners forget about sometimes is the idea that just a cell from just being a cell, doing what a cell does, making energy. It produces a lot of what's called oxidative stress, which is sometimes referred to as a free radical. Does everyone kind of know what a free radical is? It's a molecule, it's very unstable, and it's looking to stabilize itself, and it's causing damage as it's trying to just calm itself down and get what it needs to calm down. So just a cell being a cell, creating energy, doing what it does, meets our definition of toxicity in that it can cause damage. And there's a certain amount of that that's really just expected. That's going to happen within the cell. But in children, in a 2-month-old cell, and in a 6-month-old cell, and a 5-year-old cell, that demand is changing and expanding really rapidly. So this little cell is expected to respond to an ever-increasing metabolic demand every single day. It's being expected to manage this degree of toxicity or damage all the time, and it's responding to its environment all of the time. So the point here that I want to make is that there is a certain amount of ability for the cell to compensate for what is expected within the cell. But children in particular, because of their metabolic rate, because they're growing so rapidly, it can sometimes be hard for them to keep up with that pace, sort of depending on what they're dealing with. So in addition to that, children are developing and growing an immune system, right? And so that is another thing very specific to a growing and developing cell. So now the cell is trying to determine, it's getting something from the outside environment that it hasn't seen before. It's trying to determine if this thing belongs here or not, because I've never seen this thing before, but I'm seeing a lot of new things as a cell all the time. So if I'm determining that it doesn't belong here, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to try to determine what's the appropriate action. Do I sound the alarm and make a really big deal about everything? Or maybe I'm going to talk to my cell friends. Does everybody else see this thing here, or is it just me? Maybe I've got other things to do in the cell right now that are more important. Some of these other metabolic processes are taking precedent over that, and I'm just going to sit and wait and determine what's going on there. So here again, a growing and developing child's immune system has all of these decisions to make, and it's all happening simultaneously. It's all happening very rapidly. Thousands of reactions happening, just kind of path of least resistance, and all of these reactions are influencing all of the other reactions within the immune system, within the cell. But this is, to an extent, this is expected. Right? The body is equipped with what it needs to be able to do this for the most part, and for the most part, it happens pretty readily. But what happens when the cell comes into contact now with something that's not expected, like a heavy metal, like a pesticide, like a bacteria of some kind, or, well, I guess we kind of mentioned the bacteria. But what's happening now? I've never seen this thing before. What's an appropriate reaction now to this thing that I've absolutely never seen before? And here again, I'm managing my own internal environment. I'm managing an appropriate reaction to my external environment. Now I have this thing that is not expected in my environment, and now I've got to respond to that appropriately. And here again, growing and developing children, they're just going to have varying degrees of being able to compensate for these types of things. So in a 2-year-old cell that's never come into contact with this toxin before, they maybe need to make some proteins to be able to stabilize this toxin and move it out of the cell. Or maybe it needs to be sequestered and packaged away. And certain things need to be triggered within the cell to make that happen. But this toxin is causing damage. That's what we've defined a toxin as at this point. So now the cell is struggling to make appropriate decisions with cellular mechanisms that are also being damaged, on top of a system that is also struggling to maintain just baseline, normal, expected cellular damage. So all of this together is what I'm calling metabolic compensation. Right? So the idea that an individual is capable of responding to their internal environment and their external environment appropriately, or if they're not handling it appropriately, are they capable then of building in some compensatory mechanisms? Because we don't always handle everything appropriately, but sometimes the cell can figure out a way around it, and it can figure out ways to manage this damage on some other level. So that's really the kind of the idea behind metabolic compensation. If you kind of take nothing else away from it, that's kind of what I'd like you to remember. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the cell handles it appropriately it determines that it is a toxin, it makes the appropriate protein, sends it out on its way, right? So where does it go? Does anybody know? Like, if I'm a toxin, I'm floating around in the body, where am I going to end up? Where am I going to go? Anyway, other cells, it's a possibility. It might be picked up.
Brain.
The brain is a possibility. Hopefully not.
The liver.
The liver. That's what I'm looking for. So the liver is an organ system that is very specifically designed to do this internal processing that we've been talking about, deciding what stays, what goes, and if it goes, how does it go? And the liver cells are actually some of the longest lived cells in the human body, and that is by design. The liver cells are equipped with what they need to be able to manage toxins, but it does that through learning and through coming into contact with. And sometimes it has to come into contact with things multiple times before it actually chooses the right path or it actually makes the right decision. And so as it starts to make these decisions, it equips itself with pathways and proteins and things that it needs to be able to manage these toxins. But until the body has come into contact with that, it's not necessarily making the best decision at that given time, because liver cells are similar to our other cells in that it's still dealing with its internal environment, still dealing with its external environment, and still figuring out what's appropriate. A big part of what the liver does is it makes enzymes, and what enzymes basically are proteins that take one molecule and they turn it into a different molecule. And for the sake of the liver, what it's mostly doing is it's adding a substance to the molecule to make it more water soluble so that it's more slippery, so that it can be eliminated in the urine. So that's a big part of what it does. But it's got a lot of choices in these enzymes that it can make. And sometimes in doing so, it actually makes these compounds a little more toxic on their way out of the body. And so here again, the body's just learning, it's developing, it's kind of figuring it out as it goes. And all of this, of course, in children is one of those things that until they've actually seen it, it's maybe going to be hit and miss in terms of how effectively they're capable of doing that. So let's recap. We've talked a little bit about the internal environment. We've talked about the external environment, both expected and unexpected, and organ systems and their ability to process all of this as well. But there's another thing that's specific to children, and that is that they're not just trying to assimilate their environment and grow. They're trying to grow a body. They're trying to actually create new cells and lay down bone and lay down muscle. They've got a lot of work to do, these cells do. They're not just assimilating toxins, they're figuring out how to grow. And that takes a lot of nutrient. And so what the cells will do to get that nutrient is they will transport or grow these transporters in the cell membrane. So the cell membrane holds the cell together essentially, and it keeps the wrong things out, it lets the right things in. And the way that it lets the right things in are these transporters, which, as the name suggests, allows for things to kind of come through that cell membrane. So the cell is saying, I need this specific protein, and I need this specific mineral, and I need this vitamin, and their cell membranes are absolutely saturated with these transporters. They're little sponges. They're trying to grow, and they have these very specific needs, and they're asking for these very specific needs to be met. But do you want to guess how toxins get in the body? Cellular transporters, right? So their body is asking for nutrient, and it's getting toxin instead, right? And so what these toxins do, again, they cause damage. So they can damage the ability of these cellular receptors to be able to absorb whatever it is they need. Or in some cases, they might ride in on those cellular receptors. That might happen as well. And if that's the case, if I'm asking for a protein and something came through this transporter, it looks a lot like that protein. That's how it got through. So now the cell's got to figure out that that's not a protein, that's a toxin, and that's damaging to me, right? So not only are we looking at, this kind of internal environment, external environment sort of simulation, but we have just the fact that kids, frankly, they absorb more toxins. And that's just kind of the nature of being a child. And this is why I see much bigger numbers of toxin on our tox screens in children. It's just something that I'm accustomed to seeing, unfortunately. I just see really big numbers. But there's actually one more thing that's really specific to children. Does anybody think they might know what it is? Or conceive of, or perceive of? The ideas? They're growing a brain. They're growing and developing a brain on top of everything else. And this is arguably probably the most important aspect of toxicity in children, is that not only is the brain comprised of cells that are similar to other cells in that it's trying to navigate the world around us and figure out the appropriate response within the cell, and it's super saturated with all these cellular transporters. Oh, by the way, I'm also trying to develop a consciousness as well and lay down the neural network that's going to be responsible for that higher cognitive executive functioning that they're going to use to navigate this psychosocial network that we all subscribe to for the rest of their lives. Right? And so we're trying to help them build a window so that they can see the entire outside world. And we want that window to be as big and as crystal clear as humanly possible. But when the cell is congested, when it's damaged, when it doesn't know whether this is a toxin, when it's getting a toxin instead of a protein, it's not able to develop that cellular structure the way in which it should so that normal cognitive development can occur. And this is essentially kind of why, so there's this degree of variability in each individual cell, right? We're all, hopefully we're all taking that away from this at this point. And so each individual cell might be compensating, doing well, and then it doesn't. And then it just can't anymore. And that's sometimes why we'll see a sudden onset of symptoms that are related to the development of the brain. Sometimes it's gradual, sometimes it's subtle. And that's because each of us have different abilities to be able to manage this stuff. So you can have two kids in the same environment, eating the same food, they're drinking the same water, they're by all accounts living pretty much the same life. And one of them is completely neurotypical, maybe a little hyper or something like that, but neurotypical. And then the other one can have autism, right? And that has to do with the ability of their brains to be able to tolerate what's happening in their external environment. And we can't always tell based on symptoms what's actually happening within the cell for that reason. We can kind of tell where the toxins are accumulating to an extent. So if the toxins are accumulating in a part of the brain that's called the limbic system, then we oftentimes get emotional dysregulation, which will lead to symptoms of like oppositional defiance disorder or emotional attachment disorders. Or if you have the toxins sequestering in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, then we'll sometimes see like tics, Tourette's, OCD type symptoms, sometimes in a pretty explosive and dramatic fashion. If the toxins are occurring somewhat globally and that lack of ability to compensate is occurring somewhat globally, then we would see the more global pervasive developmental disorders, autism, and any degree there too, right? So you might, if autism is a 10, you might turn the dial down to 7 in an individual who's compensating a little bit, and we're gonna call it Asperger's at that point. And so because of this, it's really kind of hard for me to say, well, you're symptomatic, you've clearly got a degree of toxin A or toxin B. Frankly, it's kind of impossible. So far, we've talked about a couple of things. We've talked about the internal environment of the cell. We talked about the ability of the cell to handle its external environment, so that kind of metabolic compensation. We've talked about variability in how individual cells will absorb toxin. And then there's this degree of what's sequestration, which is these different parts of the body will handle toxins differently. And sometimes toxins will build up in certain parts of the brain and body. And of these three things, we can test for one. We can test for the degree of toxicity. So that's where we start. And the more global, the more extreme that the developmental issues are in the individual, the more that I'm going to advocate that you do all of the toxin tests, because I just simply can't predict what's actually happening there and what the degree of toxicity is. And we want to know everything we're dealing with. Because when we test, we do a couple of things. We look for where is this toxin coming from, right? We want to remove it from the environment as best we can. Because if we have a fragile child who's unable to compensate, then the toxin that's not affecting me and it's not affecting you is affecting them pretty profoundly. And so we need to try to find the source of that particular toxin. This is by far the hardest part of my job. These toxins, some of these toxins are so ubiquitous, they're just so everywhere, that a lot of times I find myself saying, well, you know, put in the buffers everywhere that you can, knowing that to some extent this is unavoidable. Maybe your child is absorbing more, maybe they're sequestering differently, but we still, if we can, we want to try to find the source, because that's a very important aspect of removing it from their body. But the other thing that, you know, doing this testing does is helps us to be able to predict the likelihood of how long they're going to be doing this treatment and what their sort of outcomes. We're going to be using different treatment protocols based on what we find, and it kind of gives us an idea of how far we have to go when we're looking at this kind of step-by-step process of removal. So we do a number of different toxin tests at our laboratory. We do what's called the GPL tox, which looks at those pesticides and the non-metal chemicals that we're all exposed to that are in pretty high amounts. And that's a pretty simple urine test. Anybody can do it. That's the one where I typically see pretty big numbers in kids. And it's the one that I'm going to probably make the recommendation that just about anybody might want to do if they're curious about their toxic representation. We also do a test that is called the mycotoxin test. That stands for mycology, or mold. And mold toxins are important because they are some of the most toxic substances on the planet. So if we find this in your child, this is going to be the priority over everything else we find. And we're going to be on a manhunt for trying to find where that mold is coming from, because mold hides, you know. And so that's a really big part of why we would want to identify that, because if it's present, even in a little bit, even in small amounts, it can be very dramatic. We can also test for heavy metals. That's a hair analysis, and some of you might already be a little bit familiar with that. Well, and so toxic metals, you know, I see less often than I did 10 years ago when I first started doing this, but I definitely do still see them. There are pockets of individuals who are being exposed completely unknowingly, and you know, they're maybe absorbing more, or maybe they're being exposed to more, but the way in which we remove metals differs somewhat than how we remove a lot of other toxins. So not only are we going to be looking at trying to find the source in the environment if we can, but also, again, affecting treatment pretty much so. Now, I did say that we can't determine how well that a cell is compensating, and that's true. I can't determine how an individual cell is compensating, but I can get a feel for how the sum total of all the cells in the body are compensating, and that's part of our organic acid test. So that test is looking at, it's giving us a finger on the pulse of, you know, how well is this cell capable of meeting the energetic demands? How much damage is there occurring here? What's really going on? It is looking at, when we talked about the function of enzymes earlier, a protein that takes one molecule and turns it into another. When this enzyme doesn't have the nutrient that it needs, when it's being damaged from toxins, it can't carry out that reaction. So this over here starts to build up. So that's what we start to look at. We start to look at the buildup of some of these products that aren't being carried through because there's damage occurring within the cells. And these proteins, these enzymes, they have very specific functions. So we're looking at how can we help to create what is needed to make that particular aspect of the cell more highly functional, so the cell can do what it needs to do to get the work done. It's also really helpful at identifying very specific aspects of neuroinflammation, or an inflammation that's occurring within the brain and body and nervous system, and we'll make some very targeted approaches around that if we see it. And it also looks at what are called opportunists, and those are basically, they're pathogens, but they live in us pretty much harmoniously for most of the time. But when our body is compromised as a result of toxicity, and we're dealing with this and we're dealing with that, and we've got our internal and we're growing, and all of that happening simultaneously, there becomes a dysregulation in the body's ability to respond appropriately to pathogens is what happens. So these bugs that weren't causing us a problem before, now they become a problem. Now they start competing for nutrients with other microbes, and the immune system isn't capable of handling it as appropriately anymore. So we look for those opportunists. We look for ways that we might maybe kind of hold the fort, build up scaffolding around the cell in an attempt to make it more manageable for us to be able to ultimately prioritize, right? So now that we know what we're dealing with, we're going to take that priority out of the cell, or the responsibility of this child, and now we're going to be the ones deciding what goes first, in what order, and how. So the treatments are going to clearly be very individualized based on what we find and what parts of the cell are maybe a little more damaged than others, what type of nutrients are specific to each child, and that kind of thing. But there are some commonalities. So the commonalities are, we're going to supersaturate the cell with nutrient. It's been asking for this nutrient. And some cells are asking for very specific nutrient. So we're going to do that. We're going to supersaturate. It's going to help get this cell what it needs to be able to rebuild. It's also like kind of throwing elbows with toxins, like, get out of my way, toxin, I'm coming through. So we're kind of preventing, to an extent, some of the toxicity that we're going to be liberating. We're going to probably use some sort of heat therapy. What heat does is it agitates these molecules, it makes them uncomfortable, and it makes it easier for the body to liberate them from the cell. I kind of use the analogy of, like, if you had a pan, like a frying pan with grease on it, it's, to get that grease off, you're going to use heat, you're going to use hot water, you're going to put it back on the stove. It's the same principle. A lot of these toxins are lipophilic, they like fat, they stick to fat, and so heat just makes them more uncomfortable so that they can slide out of the cell a lot more easily. It's really that simple. Another thing that heat does is it increases blood flow to our organs of elimination. And so clearly we want to capitalize on these pathways of elimination that already exist within the individual, and essentially that's what we're going to be doing by using heat therapy, passive or active. So passive would be saunas, biomats, hot baths. Active would be like exercise, anything like that just increases heat in the body. We're also probably going to use something called a binder. A binder is designed to either make a compound more or less soluble, depending on where it's at. So if something is in the bloodstream, we want to make it more water soluble. We want it to be eliminated in the urine. So we'll use things that make it a little bit more slippery, makes it easier to get out of the system. Something is in the gastrointestinal tract, though, we want it to be less soluble. We want it to be eliminated in the stool. We don't want to reabsorb it. Once it's in the gut, we want it on its way out. So we'll use kind of specific binders depending on the toxin that we find, the degree of toxicity, and just, we probably are going to use both in most cases, because when we're doing this heat therapy, we're liberating what we can see and we're liberating what we can't. So very often we're using both of those things. In terms of, what to expect from treatment, I should probably also mention, we'll also do things to kind of suppress these opportunistic pathogens that sometimes are creeping up. We want to hold the gate there, and we might increase immunity or decrease the immune system depending on what we find. So supporting the cell as well. But it's a little bit unpredictable what to expect when you're putting your child through a detoxification process, because we're moving stuff in pretty big quantity through the cell, through the system, in a system that we already know is fragile. So we can't really always predict, but it can feel kind of like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. You can have good days, you can have bad days. You might get a little bit of regression, or you might find that, wow, things are going exceptionally well, and then all of a sudden, what's happening? So it's a little bit unpredictable, but that's why you're working with Vaughn, because he can help you to kind of manage that, so is this expected? Is this not expected? Do we need to add something in? Do we need to peel something away? How are we going to adjust accordingly? Because we really want to be aware of the fragility of this nature of the child's cell. So we want to be very careful and do it very thoughtfully and that sort of thing. So that's why working with Vaughn is so important. It's also why retesting is so important, because you can get out ahead of these symptoms and you can feel like you're doing really well and like things are going really well, and you think, great, toxin done, we're back. and you do a retest and you find everything just went up. Everything's way high. And it can be very discouraging, but rest assured that this is actually expected. This is like what we're wanting to do. We're wanting to liberate stuff. We're wanting to get it out of the body and into the urine. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a re-exposure. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's an ongoing exposure. What it means is that it's working, but that you have farther to go. All right, so symptoms alone, they just don't give us the whole story. They give us an idea, particularly when we take some steps backwards, they can give us an idea about what's happening in that lack of compensation, but steps forward don't always tell the whole story. So retesting is actually really quite helpful in that respect, and being in close contact with Vaughn and your practitioner, that kind of thing. So if you guys take nothing else away from this talk, I'm hoping that you kind of get the feel for the idea that each individual is very different, and we're always ever changing, ever responding to our environment and making choices that are either appropriate or inappropriate. And that's especially exaggerated in children. So that's something that they are working against as a growing and a developing cell. And that's part of why not only testing is important, but it's part of why there's some unpredictability in symptoms and in outcome as well. So I'm hoping that you guys have questions for me, because yes?
How do you get your doctor to prescribe these, or do you just do this on your own, these tests?
So Vaughn will help you quite a bit. He can prescribe the tests for you. A lot of these agents are, they're natural, they're over the counter. So they're supplemental things that you would add in, and really working with, you could do it on your own, but I just don't advocate for it, because there's so many things that are unexpected and unpredictable, especially with children and in a growing and developing body. So
Vaughn.
Yes, Vaughn Lawrence. He is the one who runs this whole shindig, and he's capable of not only ordering the test, but walking you through the treatment protocols, helping you with follow-up, and helping you to understand what's expected, what's not.
So you can't expect your child's pediatrician to do this.
You'd have to have a really rock star pediatrician.
Are there some out there?
There are. Most of them are not in Kansas and Missouri, but
Okay.
yes.
So you all are covered by some insurance?
We are. So the organic acid test has been in use for many, many decades. And so that does tend to get covered by TRICARE, Medicare, and certain forms of Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Not so much, but we can file out of network. It's going to be cheaper for you probably to pay out of pocket and then file. But yeah, you can apply a lot of this stuff to your out of network. Some of the stuff, like the toxin testing that we've developed, is really new. So insurance companies don't even know what to do with that. They have no idea what it even means, really. The equipment isn't new. It's been used for many, many years. But the organic acid test has been around a while, and we can sometimes get that covered. Yeah.
Now, do you just treat children and
Good question. Yeah.
For instance, for my story, I grew up, I was overweight as a child, and then, ended up with an eating disorder for 7 years, and I'm sure a lot of my enzymes were depleted.
Sure.
And I've heard that once those enzymes are depleted,
Yeah.
that your body cannot reproduce those.
That's not true.
Okay, that's not true. Okay, I heard that once, but I wasn't sure. But I also heard that the brain those neurons are continually developing, whether you're a child or
So true.
whatever
So
age
true.
it is.
Yeah, it slows down in adulthood, but it is still happening. Absolutely. That's how we retain knowledge.
Yeah.
So it's the same sort of stuff. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and definitely
So these
look
tests
at
are available for adults.
absolutely. Yes. So
And are they as accurate for children as they are for
they are for sure. Yeah. Same sort of stuff. What I find in adults is that they tend to compensate better because their cells have been able to manage this stuff. So they're kind of dragging themselves through life, and maybe they're maybe it's a fatigue, and maybe it's manifesting as anxiety or depression. So it doesn't tend to manifest as like a global developmental thing, but maybe it's brain fog, like I can't concentrate as well as I once could. You know, those kind of things are what we tend to see in adults who, for the most part, their neural network is pretty well established, but it's still being affected.
But when you take them out of the realm of what they're used to, they're just kind of like, they might either deal with that change or they might kind of freeze with the change. So.
On a metabolic level, there's a lot of similarities between kids and adults in that there's a lot of unpredictability, you know, as far as how your body's going to handle it. And that's part of why we go really slow with detoxification in adults or kids, right? Because we're pulling stuff out that's maybe been in there for a while. Your body's sequestering it for a reason. It's trying to keep it out of harm's way. So we're pulling it through, and we're hoping that we've supported you well enough for you to be able to manage it. But there can be good days and bad, and if you have a bad day, you slow down, you know, and we put in more supports, and then we kind of go back at it. And identifying the source in adults is actually, I don't want to say easier, it's maybe not the right term, but because kids absorb so much, it's so hard for me to tell like what, you know, what's really going on here. But in adults, I'm going to really be making a case for you to try to find what the source of the toxicity is. You know, there are people who detoxify less effectively, and that is sometimes evident in these test results too. We can sometimes do a little bit of a process of elimination to try to determine if that's the case. But I'm always going to be advocating that we try to find the source, especially in adults, especially if we find one of those mycotoxins, because those are really bad.
I wonder with kids that do deal with eating disorders, like if their body has a tendency to hold on to more toxins because it's trying to hold on to whatever it can.
Well, I kind of argue almost the other way around. So I would tend to argue that toxicity might be causing a pathology in the brain that would be manifesting as an eating disorder. Yeah. Good question. Good question. Yes?
What kind of test is that? Is it blood work? Is it?
Thankfully, it's urine. It's all urine. There's one hair analysis, and the rest is urine. So, yeah, it's a nice.
You mentioned urine, but I thought just
Yeah, yeah. Well, we can do blood tests too. We have blood tests that we can do, but that's, yeah, mostly urine.
urine.
Yeah, which is nice.
So what do you think about the hair analysis and all that other stuff that sometimes?
Oh, the hair analysis is great. I mean, it's actually backed by the CDC for managing metals and stuff like that. So we can't determine where the exposure came from when we're looking at the hair, and that's a drawback. And we can't always determine the extent of exposure from a hair analysis, but we can determine exposure has taken place. So yeah, that's been used actually for a lot of years, the hair has, for heavy metal toxicity. It's actually really a very good tool for that.
You can get that from the urine, right? From the urine test.
Well, metals are not very water soluble. So the only time you would measure metals in the urine is if you were using an agent to make them more water soluble. Yeah. That's a good question though. Yeah. What else?
Does the hair test work well when you have color treated hair?
So if you don't have color treated hair, you've got to let it grow out for about an inch or so. But you can also collect pubic hair as well. So that's an option. So, yeah.
You mentioned ODD. What was
Oh, thank you.
lymphatic system?
ODD is oppositional defiance disorder.
My son has all the symptoms of that.
Mhm.
So that really, I wanted to make sure you said the lymphatic system. Is that what you said?
Well, I'm sorry, the limbic. So that's the area of the brain that is the most affected when there's oppositional defiance disorder. Yeah.
Can you reverse ADHD and
Sometimes.
autism and all that?
Sometimes. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes we just make those symptoms a lot more mild. But yeah.
A lot of questions about autism is associated with all the vaccines.
Well, so the idea is that individuals who are susceptible to toxicity might be less likely to be able to compensate for any number of the things that could be in a vaccine. So it could be the adjuvant that's added. It could be, they remove most of the metals, but it could be the fact that here again, we have an immune system that hasn't quite figured out how to respond to the world appropriately yet. And we're adding in what is basically something their immune system is supposed to handle appropriately, but we don't actually have any way of predicting whether they're going to handle that appropriately, right? So there's just this susceptibility in certain vulnerable populations, but unfortunately we don't always know until we see the fallout. That's what's happening. So it could be any number of things. It could be the actual, what's called the antigen itself, or it could be the additives. It could be the combination of those two things. But it certainly is related to that individual's response to it, right? Because not everybody gets the vaccine gets autism. We know that. So we know that there's some individuality within the cell that is making it less likely that this individual is capable of responding appropriately. And we still have a lot to learn about that. And it's just so like nobody wants to research that kind of stuff really. You know, it's just so underfunded and yeah, almost taboo really. So people don't, yeah. It's a good question though.
Can you reverse autism in any?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. It's possible. It definitely happens. We have a couple of those people working with us at the laboratory whose children are completely recovered. Yeah. I don't want to sugarcoat anything. There are kids who just get more functional, you know, or they are, maybe they go from being autistic to being maybe Asperger's, or, you know, ultimately, if you've got a child that's got toxicity in them, don't you kind of want to remove it no matter what, you know, and just give them the best possible chance at being able to lay down a healthy neural network. I mean, kids are amazingly resilient. If you remove these factors that are triggering inappropriate responses in their body, they respond quick. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So, yeah.
If you have some of these treatments and you remove them, what's the return rate like of, I mean, because we live in a world that's full of toxins.
Great question.
Is it something that's kind of going to be kind of an ongoing treatment after it's initially?
It's a great
Or
question.
How fast is the return?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So that depends on a lot of things. So as children grow and they come into contact with more stuff, they get a little bit better equipped to be able to handle this stuff. As their liver starts to develop more, as you take that burden off and their cell goes, oh, okay, wait, I know what to do now, I've got this, right? So it starts to kind of figure it out. But you're right, we're always being exposed to toxins. You can't put enough buffers in that child's life to make sure that they're never exposed to toxicity again. So in a fragile child like that, some degree of follow through and sort of, I would say, just indefinite detoxification, maybe like once a year or every couple of months, depending on the individual. A lot of moms that I talk to, they're like, yes, we're dealing with yeast again. We need to deal with this. They know the symptom. They get them on the treatment. They get it under control. Or yes, I can tell that, you know, things are happening and we start to do some more testing and figure out what's going on. But some degree of detoxification is probably going to be necessary indefinitely if you have a fragile child. Yeah.
So how often would you suggest? So we're going to test, we're going to see what the load is.
Yeah.
You want to test again to see whether what
You got it out.
But like
Yeah.
how often in general might we be looking at?
So what do you do, Vaughn? I usually recommend 3 months.
Yeah, I usually say wait at least 3 months,
Yeah.
you know, to get results, but sometimes 6 months is okay.
Yeah.
These things take time to get out of the body, and you know, plus you want to see results.
Yeah,
So if
yeah.
you do it too quickly, and you're just like, oh man, it's
Yeah.
not working or whatever.
Yeah, it can be discouraging if you do it too
Yeah,
quick.
3 to 6 months.
Yeah. Yeah.
Plus you said you'd see a bigger load sometimes.
You definitely do in the beginning. Most often you're going to see an increase.
So wouldn't you
And that's a
want
good
to
thing.
wait longer for that first testing?
Yeah, you could argue that. You could argue that. Really the benefit of doing it is if you've got a person who's symptomatically improved quite a bit, and you're like, okay, are we done? Is this really it? Or do we need to go further? That's a really good time to retest.
So most of those toxins are sequestered in fat or even in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
It
Yes.
can be sequestered anywhere.
Anywhere. It can be sequestered anywhere, but they like the brain because the brain's a fatty tissue. Yeah, but actually there's a really interesting science around the study of how different compounds are attracted to different organ systems and different tissues. So certain things just like certain organ systems better. That's kind of the nature of it. But yeah, the brain's a real easy target for a lot of these
Let's
things.
do like one more, and we'll wrap it up.
Yes, one more. Somebody's got
The
one.
grand finale.
Yeah. No?
I
Okay.
have one one.
Yeah.
My daughter has CP.
Uh-huh.
Do you have any experience?
So not as much with that particularly, but I will say that there are a lot of things that we can do because the lungs that are so vulnerable to toxicity, that there's a lot of things that we can do, but we need to put in a lot of extra supports in these kids. They need a lot more of those binders, particularly the glutathione. But talk to me after this. Yeah. Let's talk about that because there's a lot that you can do to help mobilize toxins, but we should talk about specific supports for CP kids.
Yeah, that's what I
Yeah, definitely. Yes. All right. Thanks, everybody.